Welcome to Love and Abuse, the show about helping you identify poisonous communication and toxic behavior. You deserve to be treated with respect and kindness. That's why it's important that you learn to pinpoint manipulative and controlling behavior so that you keep your power and your sanity. I'm your host, Paul Coliani. Welcome to another episode of Love and Abuse, and I just want to remind you that all the information in this show is meant for educational purposes only. Always seek a professional for your mental health and well-being. And I have to say that because, we talk about a very sensitive topic on here sometimes. Emotional abuse can turn into more aggressive behavior. Not always, and I would say, I'm going to put a guess out there. I would say more likely than not, it won't turn into a physical abuse. Physical abuse does happen and can escalate from emotional abuse. But from what I've seen, if the emotionally abusive behavior has been going on for years and years, and there's been no sign of any violent or physically aggressive attacks or confrontations, then it's probably not going to go into that realm. But I say that carefully because it can. And I've heard from people that said, I was in an emotionally abusive relationship and then it did turn physical. And these are extreme cases. There are extreme cases of emotional abuse. So I don't want you to tune into this show and make you think that the emotionally abusive types of relationship I'm talking about are this severe all the time. You can look at my relationship. When I was married many years ago, I was an emotionally abusive person, but I would never, ever have laid my hands on her in a physically aggressive way. I would never have shoved her. I would never have grabbed her arm tight or anything like that. I just wasn't that type of person. And you're going to find people out there that are emotionally abusive, manipulative, controlling, both consciously they're aware they're doing it and unconsciously they're not aware they're doing it, and more physically aggressive and not physically aggressive at all. So there's all kinds of people out there that do all kinds of behaviors. And just because you may or may not be experiencing, or someone may or may not be experiencing an emotionally abusive relationship, doesn't mean it's going to escalate. It can. So that's the awareness factor. And that's why I say, you have to get this assessed by a professional, or in my personal opinion, not my professional opinion, but my personal opinion, you evaluate your relationship and you can tell how someone's behavior is going to progress or not. If they're getting progressively worse, personally, you can tell it's going to turn into something more severe. And that you need to be very observant and acutely aware of what it can turn into. If it gets more severe, you have to get more diligent for yourself. You should anyway. You should really focus on yourself and healing yourself and increasing your self-worth and self-esteem and your confidence, and really preparing yourself to move into the next stage of being, whether that's leaving the person or working with the person, or really standing up for yourself, boundaries, and insisting that your values are honored, and just getting into alignment with yourself so that you can convey to the other person what's important to you. And when you convey to them what's important to you, you should expect them to abide by what's important to you. So, that might take a while. If you've been in a relationship where you have not gotten along that well, or you're always told that you're wrong, or you're doing something wrong, or you're ruining the relationship, or you're sabotaging the relationship, and you often feel guilty and you feel bad, and you try and there's nothing that you can do. It just seems like everything you try never seems to work out to help them or help the relationship. Then you might be experiencing emotional abuse at a level that is a little out of your control, which is why I say often when you are in this type of relationship, instead of focusing on trying to change them or fix them or heal them, you got to focus on yourself. You got to focus on healing you. And so with that preliminary commentary, I'm going to read you an email that I received that has to do with boundaries and a few other things. And I'm just going to make comments like I did in the last episode as I go through the email. I get a lot of emails and I simply can't get to them all. I would have to release an episode every day or 2 episodes a day just to keep up with the emails. But I don't want to deter you from sending them. I'm just telling you that when I get them, I may not be able to get to them very quickly. So I'll just put that caveat out there. If you send me an email, I do get them, I do read them, and I try to get to every topic that are in them. I may not read yours in particular, but I will absorb the topic. I will absorb the subject matter of the email and incorporate it into my show. So even if I don't read your email, I'm trying to hit on everything that you might be going through if you sent me an email. So anyway, let me read you this email, and like I said, I'll make some comments as we go along. Hey, Paul, I just want to tell you how helpful your podcast has been for me. It has really opened my eyes to the situation that I am in, and I have been in for many years. I read some stuff about gaslighting and emotional abuse before and thought, yes, this is what's happening. But when I brought it up to the therapist, he discounted it, and we never really pursued the topic any further. Okay, I'm going to stop right there because this is a problem. Now, there are some great therapists out there, and they know exactly what gaslighting is. They know the confusion techniques that manipulators pull. They know all of the minimizing and invalidating and all the connecting the dots, like I talked on the last episode. They know how to tell a one-off event that may not be seen as emotional abuse, but a pattern of that event can be seen as emotional abuse. There's a lot of great therapists that can tell that, and there's a lot of therapists that don't know what that is, that don't know the extent of emotional abuse, that think emotional abuse is something else, like someone just swearing at you or getting angry at you and making you feel bad. Yes, those are parts of emotional abuse, but if you've been listening to this show, and I hope you have listened to every episode because you're going to get something from every one of them, because I cover a lot of topics, but if you've been listening to every episode, you've heard me say how spread out emotional abuse can be in the relationship and how that is normally how you identify it. You can't often specifically identify a single behavior as a manipulative or controlling or emotionally abusive behavior. I mean, I can, and maybe you are informed enough that you can as well now, but so many people, professionals that have studied for years and years and years and have PhDs and degrees, some of them know about how to identify emotional abuse, and some of them aren't that well versed in it. This is why it's important that if you are seeking a therapist, you ask them, do you know about emotional abuse? Do you know what it consists of and what the signs are? Because that'll be an important question that you'll want an answer to. And depending on their answer, you can assess if that's the right therapist for you. How do you know what to ask? Well, I do have an episode that maybe you should listen to before you give them a call. That episode is called, let me look for it here. Here it is, Emotional Abuse Explained for Your Friends, Family, Attorney, Therapist, or anyone else that may need to know what you're experiencing. That's the whole title. If you go to loveandabuse.com, you're going to find that. You just have to look for Emotional Abuse Explained. And then the rest of it, you don't have to type in, but it says for your friends, family, attorney, therapist, or anyone else that you may need to know. Listen to that episode and take notes. That way, when you call someone and say, do you know about emotional abuse? Do you know how to identify it? How to see the patterns of it? You can have these bullet points from that episode and say, well, are you familiar with this? Do you understand this? And if they are giving you spotty answers, or if they just say, oh yeah, I know about relationships, I can handle it, I can talk about that. If they're not giving you specific answers and they're giving you very broad answers, oh yeah, relationship issues, I'm an expert in all that stuff, I would be careful to go with them. I would want to hear a therapist expand on the bullet points instead of just give you a broad answer like, oh yeah, I know all that stuff. You want to be careful about that because you need someone that can identify this. If you're going to a therapist or a counselor of any sort, you want to make sure that they understand emotional abuse. At least the common terms like gaslighting and stonewalling and even the defensive postures that you might have to take, like no contact and gray rock. There's all of these terms that aren't necessarily in the therapeutic realm, but one who studies narcissistic abuse, verbal abuse, psychological abuse, they're going to know these terms. And if they don't know these terms, they might have a slightly different name for them, maybe more scientific. But if they don't know these terms or what they mean, or if they broadly categorize it as something else, then that might not be the right person for you. That's why I'm glad when I hear from therapists and counselors that listen to this show, because that means they're getting educated. Not that I am the only source for this, but they are studying, they are researching, they are doing their best so they can help their clients. I think that's a phenomenal service for so many people because emotional abuse is so prevalent. And the intricacies and nuances of emotional abuse aren't as well known, at least from what I've heard from my clients who go to therapists and say, my therapist didn't know about any of this stuff or couldn't guide me in this stuff. And this email, this person found out that her therapist just dismissed it pretty much. He said, when I brought it up to the therapist, he discounted it and we never really pursued the topic any further. That's a big red flag in therapy. Not that I'm blaming the therapist because the therapist might have been great at what he did, but emotional abuse is so specific and very particular in how it happens and how it is received and what happens to that receiver, what the victim goes through, the psychological damage and emotional wounding that happens. That needs to be addressed. And if someone's gaslighting you, that needs to be addressed too. And you need to be separated from the person. In therapy, at least you might have to go by yourself and asked about what happens so that you can explain your side. Now, this is one thing that I'll highlight is that when you go to couples therapy with someone who's very good at manipulating, they can, and sometimes do, manipulate the therapist. So you have to be really careful because these people are manipulators, emotional abusers. They're usually smarter than the average bear. They're usually more intelligent. And intelligence is as what you do with it. So if they are using their intelligence to manipulate and coerce and control, that's a problem. It's a problem for the person on the receiving end of that. So if it's the same thing in the therapist office and they know how to manipulate the therapist to make them look good or make them look innocent or make you look like the bad guy, that could happen. So this is, scary to think that you can't even go to couples therapy or something, but you can. There are people that specialize in narcissistic abuse. That's probably the most popular term that you'll find amongst therapists. If they deal with and specialize in narcissistic abuse, you'll probably have better luck because then they'll be able to spot the narcissistic behavior coming out of the other person. If it exists, this is up to them to decide. In my personal experience, I've worked with clients, both couples and individual, where I could totally understand and get sucked in to some of the stories of the person who I could tell was the controlling manipulator. Not that he or she came across as a controlling, manipulative person. In fact, they usually come across as nice, rational, reasonable, intelligent, and even considering both sides of the issue and considering a lot of things. They're usually like the perfect client. Like you'll say something and they'll go, let me think about that. That's a good idea. I never thought about it that way. They will give you everything that you want to hear. They suck you into that world that you feel most comfortable in and you feel most agreeable in. And you think, wow, this person really gets it. I think they're going to, make some changes. But my radar is always on. I've always got my radar on when I'm doing any type of couples coaching, where I can see certain behaviors coming out and the things they say and how they respond, and also sometimes how they talk for the other person. and also how the other person responds. In fact, that's where most of my feedback can come from. Like if you came to me and you described your husband, your wife, your girlfriend, your boyfriend to me, and how you were talking. Like if you were saying things like, he really yelled at me the other night, and he said something that really hurt me about, me treating the kids badly or something. And I felt so guilty because, I don't know, maybe he's right. As soon as you say something like, maybe he's right, a little blip goes off on my radar. Maybe he's right. Because that is telling me that you have some self-doubt. And if someone else is able to instill self-doubt in you, my radar blip goes off, because that is one of the subtle nuances of emotional abuse. Maybe he's right. Maybe she's right. Maybe she's right about me being oversensitive. Maybe I overreact sometimes. Maybe that's true. Okay, a little radar blip comes up, and I think, okay, what is causing him or her to think this way? And I know I start to analyze it that way. But my point is, what I'm doing is not necessarily listening to the person that might be emotionally abusive. I'm just listening to the responses and the inflections and the specific words that the person who seems to be trying hard, but also seems to be failing hard and feeling bad and feeling guilty and is unsure. And I see their response and how they show up. And I see the other person and how confident they are. So I have this one person that's not too sure in him or herself. And I have this other person that seems pretty confident and seems pretty open and really open to learning new things. And again, that's going to look normal to most people. That'll look normal. That'll look like, wow, this person is really receptive. But that reception might be part of the manipulation, might be part of the game. So blip, there's my radar going off. And blip, there's my radar going off about the person who's saying, well, maybe he or she is right about me. It's a lot deeper than that, but just one little pattern that can be noticed by someone who knows about emotional abuse and narcissistic abuse and so on. So coming back to her email, she said, this is what's happening. When I brought it up to a therapist, he discounted it. So the gaslighting and the emotional abuse, he discounted it, and we never really pursued the topic any further. So, that blip on that radar should go off for you, because that in itself could be seen as an emotionally abusive behavior in a typical relationship. Meaning, if he discounts it, gaslighting, I'm sure it's part of a bigger thing. We'll talk about that. That itself, that minimizing, that invalidating both terms that I've used in talking about emotional abuse, that in itself is a blip on the radar, and it needs to be considered an orange or a red flag when you're seeking professional help. Again, not that they're a bad person or that they're not smart. It's just that they may not know the nuances of emotional abuse and kind of maybe bundled stuff in. Oh yeah, gaslighting. Every couple goes through that. We'll talk about that, or maybe we won't. So yeah, if that discount happens, if somebody minimizes or invalidates your concerns in a therapy setting, and they don't pursue the topic any further, that should be a red flag in your head. So let's maybe not go to that therapist. Or we need to find out more information if they really know the depth of that. And so I'm going to continue reading this email. So again, I thought there was something wrong with me that I needed to fix. And there's that wording, right? Is there something wrong with me? Am I doing something that's causing this? This is what she's telling me in the email. We went to couples counseling, and our same situation at home played out in the therapist's office, and the therapist sided with my husband and made me feel even worse. Now this I don't like. Regardless of the therapist's education or level of skill or knowledge of emotional abuse or not, I don't like when a therapist or a counselor or any professional sides with one person. In fact, it should never look like they're siding with someone. Never. I saw this in my marriage. We went to a couples counselor, and he seemed to be siding with me a little too much. In fact, it made me feel like him and I were ganging up on my wife. And that felt like crap, to be honest. I may have been emotionally abusive, but I still loved my wife, and I still felt that was unfair treatment, Even though, yes, it would have been great if I was right and I had someone agree with me, but it wasn't the setting for that to happen. I wanted someone unbiased to comment and talk about this stuff and talk with us to help us through it. And we didn't get that. At least I didn't feel that. And so when that started coming out, I started standing up for my wife in small, subtle ways to show that, hey, maybe it's this, maybe it's that, not this. And I wasn't getting him to kind of go along with that. And it just felt like he was too agreeable with me. So I was aware, but not everyone's going to be. So it's important that when you are in a relationship with someone and you go to couples counseling, that you are both aware and really careful about someone siding with one person or another. That doesn't mean it won't happen in small ways sometimes. Meaning, you might say something and the therapist goes, well, your partner said this, so what do you think about that? It may sound like they're siding with them, but if they do it evenly and equally throughout your sessions, that's not really siding. That's just helping one person observe the other person's behavior and make them think about what they said. That can happen. That can be, hey, let's listen to this person. Hey, let's listen to that person. And there's an equal level of listening and understanding and interaction. But when there's a true feeling of a professional being on one side, again, look for that blip in the radar. So she goes on to say, I would have panic attacks on the way to the counseling appointments, and it was so bad that I had to stop going. Well, those panic attacks are a big sign. If you are having panic attacks on the way to counseling, you might be going to the wrong counselor. I don't mean to laugh about that, but if you think about, having a panic attack before you do something, it can give you a big sign that maybe what you're doing is you're either not ready for or not right for you, or maybe you still have a fear about it, or the bottom line, what I look at it here is that's not the right counselor, because a counselor or a therapist is going to make you feel comfortable. It's going to make you feel welcome. It's going to make you feel that this is a safe place to express yourself. If you're getting panic attacks before those appointments, that's not happening. That's my guess, is that it wasn't happening, that you didn't feel safe. You felt like you were still in that perhaps judgmental or controlling environment. And now you have the ganging up feeling, ganging up on you, where you feel alone and unsupported by either person. That's a problem. So I'm sorry that you went through that, the person who wrote. And that's a real challenge. And I'm glad you stopped going, because it doesn't sound like that was the right person for you. Maybe for someone else, but not for you. So she goes on, I resonate with everything that you say in your podcast as the victim of emotional abuse. It is so hard as nobody else can see it. And he plays the role of a loving husband, father, community member to everyone else. But I have been broken down to a fragment of the person I used to be. Those are so powerful, a fragment of the person I used to be. I'm so sorry that happened to you. The blessing in all of this is that through everything that he put me through, I have done a ton of work on myself, and I regained trust in myself and my self-worth. Okay, so this email just took a big upturn. That's awesome. That is something I talk about in the Mean Workbook, that you need to work on those levels inside of you. Your self-worth, your self-compassion, your self-love, everything with the word self in front of it, you need to work on that stuff. Your self-value, your self-care in every way. So she said that she has regained trust. I mean, self-trust, that's huge. That's like one of the first things that starts to go, especially in gaslighting, is that you stop trusting yourself. And she has worked on this, and this is what I want you to work on, is trust in yourself. I mean, if you're getting panic attacks before therapy, trust in yourself. There's something wrong with that. There's something you have to look at. There's probably a big truth in there, and I don't want you to deny that truth. If you're getting panic attack before sex, big truth in there, big one. So listen to your body, listen to your mind, just start to acknowledge this stuff, validate yourself so that you can start building trust in yourself, and the things that you're experiencing like she is, or she has, when acknowledged, will continue to reinforce that what you're feeling and thinking is true. So there's a challenge there when someone's always invalidating you and making you crazy in certain ways, but it's time to really focus on yourself and realize that you're probably not the person they think you are, because outside the relationship or in other relationships that you've had or have now, you're not seen that way. Which means if you're only trusting this one source to describe you and define you, you're probably trusting the wrong source. So you have to be really careful there. So she says, I feel I am strong enough to leave now, and I'll be making changes in the next few months. I have been putting aside money, and I have a plan to get out. Even though I know I'm being controlled and emotionally abused, and I really know in my heart getting out is the best thing I can do, I have a few struggles with leaving, and I have a few questions. Okay, great. So you have decided to plan your exit. And, this is something I talk about in the workbook as well, where you can either decide to plan your exit or stay and try to work things out if that's possible. So she has decided that she's going to plan her exit because, in the workbook, I don't just say, okay, you need to leave the emotionally abusive person. Sometimes you're not ready for it. Sometimes you need time. You need time. You need time to build up your self-worth and your confidence, or like she said, putting aside money. So she is preparing her exit, and I think that's smart. When you prepare to leave, instead of just putting your hands up and going, I'm out of here, it's going to be a lot easier, even though it's still going to be difficult. I'm not going to lie. It's a difficult thing to leave someone you love that drives you crazy, emotionally abuses you, manipulates and controls you, but you still have feelings and you still have fears and you still aren't sure what you're going to do. And maybe you think that without this relationship, you're going to be alone, and being alone scares you, or you're not sure where you're going to end up. Are you going to end up on someone's couch or on the curb on the street? You don't know. So there's a lot of question marks in your head, and it's very scary, can be, to go through this. So this is why it's important to plan, to think about it, to work on yourself and get to know you and what you want, regardless if you're going to be in this relationship or not. Meaning, no matter who you're in a relationship with, what do you want for yourself? What kind of relationship do you want in general? Does this relationship fit that description of what you want in a relationship? These are all good things to know about yourself so that no matter what you do, you'll know what you want. So I'm getting closer to the end here. Even though, let me read this. We have 3 kids, and the guilt of breaking up our family system is heavy on me. Okay, so you've probably heard me talk about this before. When it comes to kids, yes, that's another factor. Absolutely. When you're going to break up, the kids are going to take it hard. Typically, they'll take it really hard, especially if they're younger, because they don't know the whole dynamic of relationships and what it means when people aren't getting along and they have to separate. It's going to be hard. Absolutely. This is just something that you absolutely have to know is going to happen. The kids will take it hard. Okay. You have to accept that. But the kids are also taking it hard now. You have to accept that too. They may not see it the way you see it. But I bet, according to this email, you're seeing mommy unhappy a lot. And if you're a dad, they're seeing daddy unhappy a lot. They're not sure why mommy or daddy doesn't play with them the way they used to. Or mommy and daddy aren't laughing like they used to, or joking around, or looks like they're in a great relationship like they used to be. They don't seem to be connected anymore. In fact, there are other things going on. Maybe there's arguments. Maybe there's a lot of upset. Maybe your youngest sees you crying and wants to know why you're crying. All of these things have an emotional impact on your children. All of these things. And so you either have a relationship where all of this is trying to be processed by children, or you have a separation and now they're going back and forth and now are dealing with a different level of all this emotional processing. And this different level is confusing because it's not their norm. So there's a norm they're used to. Okay, there's emotional abuse in the relationship, and one person's not happy and the other person is doing whatever they're doing, and they're either happy or not happy, and Maybe they're complaining about the other person. Who knows? There's a lot going on in the relationship that the children have to absorb and process and figure out. And when you're separated, there's also a lot going on there as well. But they're two separate things. They're two separate ways of being. And I'm not saying that one way is better than the other. I do know that an unhappy family often breeds unhappy children with dysfunctions later on in their relationships. I can't say that's true all the time. But I do know that when you grow up with dysfunctional parents or hurt parents, or one of them is very unhappy and the other one is blaming and accusing and making the other one feel guilty, they're learning a lot of bad behaviors. Children pick up the behaviors of the adults to learn how to treat other people. I mean, that's not the only way, but typically that is the way that gets imprinted on them. I learned so much from my mom on being the people pleaser and having no boundaries and other things that when I finally left home and started real relationships and living with my girlfriend and having years and years of what I thought would be a good relationship, it turned out that I developed all these dysfunctions because I saw how my mom was treated by my stepfather and how she treated him and how she behaved when she wasn't around him and her unhappiness, in fact, her hatred for him. That did a lot to my brain. I mean, I walked away with some quite severe dysfunctions, and I also became emotionally abusive in my relationships. I learned a lot because they stayed together. I'm not blaming them. I'm saying that one way or the other, emotional processing will take place, and your children will have to deal with it in the way they deal with it. And I'm not a big fan of couples who stay together who are unhappy, so that bleeds into their children's minds, and they have to process it, and they take it into their adult relationships when they grow up, and suddenly you have a repetitious cycle. I'm not a big fan of that. I'm not saying it's not possible. I'm not saying that some children will come out unscathed or with less issues. I'm just saying when it happens, you can often identify it in how the parents got along when they were together. And yes, there are psychological issues that happen when parents separate. So either way, I think you're going to have to deal with it. And so I say that because this gives you the choice to do one thing or another, because no matter what, it seems like they're going to have to deal with it no matter which direction you go. It's just that however they process it will be how they process it, and whatever it turns into is what it turns into. I mean, that's a generic answer, but my ultimate thought on that is if there is a separation and mommy is no longer crying at night and she's actually happier, then there might be some semblance of normalcy, at least as far as their emotional states. It may still be difficult. It may even seem impossible, because the younger the children are, the harder it is to explain to them. But at the same time, they'll be infused with our emotional states. So that's a tough one. You know, having children in the mix is a tough one. I just don't like to expose the children to any toxic elements, or at least if you have to, then the fewer toxic elements, the better. Does that mean staying together? Does that mean breaking up? That's something you'll have to decide. But again, the way I look at it is when there is a toxic situation with a dysfunctional relationship that the kids are learning from, then at least if those two people aren't together, the kids are learning not only that if you are mistreated, you should get out of the relationship, but also the fact that you shouldn't prolong something that's not working. So that's a challenge. I get what you're saying in the email, and it is a challenge. And that's something that you'd certainly have to think about for yourself and for your children and make the best choice that you think is right for them. And so let me continue reading here. He has made some changes with himself. He is seeing a therapist, although it is our couples therapist who he didn't show up honestly with in the first place. And he is not quite as reactive to me as he has been in the past. Well, at least he's seeing a therapist. You know, that's good. It may not have been the therapist that really worked for both of you. Maybe he's getting something from it. Maybe this therapist is really good with one-on-one and he's helping this person to realize, hey, maybe you shouldn't be so reactive, and this is why, or let's talk about why you're so reactive. So his being less reactive, that's good. That might be a sign that he's improving, that he's working on stuff. I personally like to see when somebody says, oh, I finally realize how I'm hurting this other person. I like to see that kind of response. It may take a while for him to get there if he ever gets there, but if he ever gets there, that would be a great response. I finally understand how I'm hurting you and why I do it. And I'm finally figuring it out. I've been so selfish. I get it now. I've been so selfish. That's the kind of response I want to see when someone's going to therapy and they're learning about themselves. Small changes, small subtle changes in their behavior. It's great. And hopefully it's a good sign, but they're still not their potential. They're still not what you need because the same challenges probably exist. So it may not be as outward or as overt as before, but it sounds like those same challenges are there. I do know that he loves me and he doesn't want to lose me. I don't know if he knows what he is doing and how bad it hurts me. Okay, so that's what I was saying. It doesn't sound like he knows how bad it hurts you. I'm afraid to explain to him what he is doing because when I have done it in the past, it has always been turned back around on me somehow. I've been working on writing a letter to him to get all my thoughts out and give it to him without derailing my thought process and breaking me down. Yes, that often happens with a debate or an argument, is that you'll start to express yourself and the other person will derail you, like you said, and start turning it around and saying, well, what about when you did this to me? And what about this? And you don't treat me right. And it's that turnaround game I talked about in another episode. And when that happens, you lose your train of thought and you can't finish what you're saying, and it becomes all about them again. And when you're in that space and you can't get back on track, that's a challenge. And I totally understand. So, writing out an email, writing out a letter, I guess that's a good idea. I'm not sure. If my wife had written out that letter, it would be really kind of weird, when I was married, if she had written out everything that I was doing to her. I don't know how I would have taken it. I really don't know if that's the best course of action or not. I think it may be worth a shot. Let's put it that way, because like you said, every time you try to get your thoughts out, he derails you, he confuses you, or he turns it around and makes it about him. And so it might be a good idea to have it all on paper. So when he reads it by himself, he can kind of absorb it all. And maybe that'll be a good idea. It really depends on the person. If he's receptive at all and he cares about you and he loves you, then it should really hit him. I mean, it should really hit him in his heart in a good way. I mean, I don't mean like stab him in his heart, but in a good way. It should hit him like, wow, I'm really doing all of this to you. I hate that. I don't want to do that to you. So maybe that's a good idea. That is your choice. I don't really have an opinion on that. I normally would have an opinion. Like, I would definitely say, write out all your thoughts, what you're going through for you so that you can understand what you're going through. Writing a letter to him, even if you don't send it, is definitely therapeutic. I'm going to write everything that you're doing to me and everything I feel and everything I think is happening here. And this is something I hope changes because XYZ. And I think that can be very therapeutic. Sending it is totally up to you. So writing it out, definitely therapeutic, definitely worth doing. Sending it, certainly. If that's the best way you can convey it for now because you're interrupted or derailed, then maybe that's the best course of action for you. So there's sort of an opinion on that. You finish by saying, my question is, do boundaries work with emotional abusers? I do not have healthy boundaries and it is something I've been working on. When I try to enforce my boundaries, he does the turnaround game and somehow finds a way to make my boundary invalid. I want to make sure that I've shown up to the relationship as fully and honestly as I can before leaving my marriage. Would love to hear a podcast on setting boundaries with emotional abusers and what that might look like. All right. That's the end of the letter. Thank you so much for sharing all of that. And the actual topic of boundaries and emotional abusers will not be a long one. The subject matter will not be something I talk about for a long period of time because I really have one short opinion on it. And that opinion is this: boundaries don't work without accountability. So your question, do boundaries work with emotional abusers? Boundaries by themselves, without accountability, meaning if they violate a boundary, what happens? What's the accountability? Boundaries without accountability typically don't work. If you say, look, I don't want you to do that anymore because when you do that, it makes me feel disrespected. It makes me feel like you don't love me. And so I'm drawing a line. I don't want you to do that behavior anymore. Let's just say that was a boundary, whatever you don't want them to do. They may or may not cross that line again. But what happens if they do? That's where the focus needs to be. Not necessarily on the boundary that you've established, but what happens when they cross the line? What happens when they violate that boundary? Because if you choose not to make them accountable, your boundary doesn't matter. Let me repeat that. If you choose to not make someone accountable for crossing the line or violating your boundary doesn't matter. In fact, it doesn't exist. So if you say, I don't want you to say, I hate you to me in front of the kids. I mean, that's an awful thing. I hope that never happens in any relationship, but I know it does. But let's just say you had to say that. I don't want you to tell me you hate me in front of the kids. That could be a boundary. And if they say, well, what if I do say it? You might say, well, I just don't want it to happen again. If you do say it, it's going to be a problem. Maybe you haven't thought about the accountability yet. Maybe you haven't thought about the repercussions of that. But you do know, and you make it a rule, and you say, I don't want you to do that. And they go, fine, I'll never do that again. But then a few weeks later, they do it. What are you going to do? And you have to ask yourself the question, does this boundary really exist? Did I really set this in stone? I mean, in my own mind, in my world, did I set this in stone? Because they just crossed it. So what are you going to do? If you let it slide, the boundary doesn't exist. If you are easy on them and saying, I told you not to do it, and here you are doing it, and you do nothing about it, but you just yell at them and hope they feel bad about it, that's not really doing anything. The boundary doesn't exist. It feels like you're doing something. It feels like you're bringing it up and reminding them, but this isn't something that turns into a reminder. This is something that turns into a steadfast rule. When you create a boundary, it is a rule. It is enemy territory. I am putting the line right here. When you cross that line, you are the enemy. And I know that's harsh. I know that's not the greatest way to look at it, but I'm trying to paint a picture that when they cross the line, they have to know there are serious consequences. What is the consequence? Boundaries can work with people that emotionally abuse. In fact, sometimes boundaries are the only thing that works with emotionally abusive people. But the boundary has to have that big A of accountability. And then the big C of consequences. ABC, accountability, boundaries, consequences. Not necessarily in that order. But think about that. If you create a boundary and someone crosses it, how are you treating them after that? You have to come up with the consequence. You have to come up with the accountability. If you say, if you cross that boundary, no sex for a month, if you're in a romantic relationship, then you follow through. Or if it's family or friend, if you cross that boundary, I'm not going to call you for a week or 2 weeks or a month. And you follow through. You don't give in. You don't text one night because you're lonely. You follow through. Boundaries are up to you. Boundaries are your steadfast rules that have to be honored, that have to be enforced, that have to be made into, for lack of a better term, enemy territory. Because when they cross the line, they're not working with you anymore. They're working against you. They're not respecting your boundaries. They're not valuing what you value. And it's important that you convey, this is my line. When you cross this, you're crossing the line and you are violating my boundaries, and I will not stand for that. And there is accountability for that. When you do that, you will be accountable. So this is standing up for yourself. Yes, boundaries do work with emotional abusers, but they have to have that ABC, accountability of the boundary and the consequence of that violation. She said, I don't have healthy boundaries, and it's something I've been working on. You have to define for yourself what's acceptable and what's not. Make that list, make it clear for you. Don't even show him yet. Make it clear for you. What do I find acceptable and what do I find unacceptable? Make that list clear for you. And then, when you're ready, you present this. I'm not saying you present it as a list, but you talk about it. You say, look, I don't want you to do this anymore. I think it's okay when you do that, but I don't want you to do this anymore. I'm drawing a line. I don't want that to happen anymore. And if he gives you any trouble, you say, look, when you do that, it hurts me. That's really how you define your boundary. I mean, part of it. It hurts me when you do that. If he doesn't know he's hurting you, part of defining your boundary to him is telling him it hurts you. Because if he loves you, he doesn't want to hurt you. And so what better way to define your boundaries by telling someone, look, when you do this, it hurts me, so please stop doing it. Well, I can't promise anything. Well, you have to. You have to promise this. You have no choice because there will be consequences. I mean, I'm conveying it in a very bold and in-your-face way. I'm not saying you have to do it that way. But if you get clear in your mind what you want for yourself, you will become bold in a healthy way for both of you. Meaning, if he really wants this relationship to continue and improve, then him knowing your boundaries and you enforcing those boundaries makes it healthier and happier. I mean, it has no choice. If he honored your boundaries and you enforce those boundaries, that means you'll be happier. I mean, not the totality of it, but I would ask you that question. If he honored every boundary that you put on your list, even if it's just a mental list, if he did honor all your boundaries, would it make you happier? I think the answer is yes. I mean, when I think about it, if I had a list of boundaries and my girlfriend said, okay, I'll abide by every one of them, and she did, I would be happiest guy in the world. And, I have a great relationship, so it's not about that. But if that's how it was, I would certainly feel a lot better if my boundaries were honored. So having him honor your boundaries makes the relationship better and should make him happier, because if you're happy, then him wanting you to be happy is all part of loving someone. That's my definition of love, supporting the other person's happiness. So having boundaries is actually a very good thing for a relationship, because the other person knows what you want and what you don't want. What better gift can you give than what someone wants, and not give them what they don't want? Those are wonderful gifts, and they're great for a relationship. So if you're working on your boundaries, keep working on them. Listen to my episode on the Overwhelmed Brain, my other podcast, theoverwhelmedbrain.com. I have episodes on boundaries. Just go to the website and type in the word boundaries. You'll find several where I talk about boundaries. I talk about that because I went through the same thing. I definitely had no boundaries when I was younger, and I had to learn how to make them and create them and have them. And so I talk about that a lot over at the Overwhelmed Brain. And so you said that he does the turnaround game and somehow found a way to make my boundary invalid. The episode I did on the turnaround game, just 1 or 2 episodes back, is definitely something you want to re-listen to if you're not utilizing that technique I told you about, where I say when they start to turn it around and make it about them. And let me just back up here because some people may not have heard that episode. Let's just say that you have a problem, when you used my car and you used all the gas and you didn't fill the gas back up, I got really angry. You said you're going to go to the gas station and fill it up, but you never did. And so the other person might say, well, what about that time that you didn't fill up my tank? Or what about that time that, name something else that's maybe even unrelated. What about that time you promised to do all the dishes and you never did them? Or what about that time that you promised that you'd take the dog for a walk, but you didn't? I call that the turnaround game, where you are conveying something, expressing something that you want to talk about. And instead of answering that and talking about that, they turn it around and make it about something that you did to them. And when that happens, you're suddenly derailed. You're suddenly put down another path. And now you feel like you have to defend yourself. So my process when that happens, even in my own life, is to mention, okay, you want to talk about that? We can, but let's talk about this first, and then we'll talk about that. I'm not saying it always works. I'm not saying that someone's going to be receptive to that, because they may continue saying, well, I want to talk about this first. And they may keep you on that subject, but hopefully you have the fortitude that you can say, okay, great. You want to talk about that? We can. So let's talk about this first. Let's talk about, the fact that you didn't put gas in my car, and then we'll talk about that, I promise. So you might have to try that. You might have to use that technique more for people that use the turnaround game, because they don't want to deal with their responsibilities. They don't want to have to defend themselves. They don't want to have to do any of that. It's a lot easier to put you on the defense and put the focus back on you so that they don't have to deal with what they might have done wrong. Because if the focus is on you, then they don't have to worry about talking about what they did wrong. It never comes back to that. It always stays on you. So you might have to listen to that episode if you haven't heard that. But that is always my go-to with the turnaround game is, okay, we'll talk about that. Great. It sounds like it really upsets you. So let's talk about that too. But address this first. You didn't put gas on my car. Why not? And hopefully you'll get a response. So I may come up with other processes or techniques on how to deal with the turnaround game, but that's the best one I can come up with so far. So I hope that helps. And what was the last thing you said? I want to make sure that I'm showing up to the relationship as fully and honestly as I can before leaving my marriage. This is what boundaries does. You asked if boundaries work with emotional abusers. When you set boundaries, when you set accountability, when they know there are consequences, and you follow through with that accountability and make them responsible so that they experience some sort of loss that's important to them, whether that's a month without sex or a month without phone calls or whatever it is, depending on the type of relationship you're in, then you are showing up as honest because you're finally standing up for yourself and presenting to the other person what you really want and how you want to be treated. It doesn't get much more honest than that. This is what I want. This is how I want to be treated. This is how I'd like you to show up in my life. That's honesty. When you can express what you want for yourself, what is acceptable, what isn't acceptable, how they can show up that makes you happy, anything that conveys to them what you want in a relationship from them or anyone that you're with. That is honesty. So doing that covers your comment about making sure that you show up as fully and honestly as you can be. That way, if and when the marriage does end, you can honestly look back and say, I told him what I wanted, I told him what I needed, and he wouldn't follow through. So I did my part. I passed the baton to him. I swung the racket. The ball was in his court. And instead of following through and playing the game fairly, he decided to cheat, or he decided to violate, or whatever he did to not honor your boundaries, not honor your path. So I hope this helps. Thank you so much for writing. I know you're in a challenging situation and you've got some difficulties ahead. It does get hard. Going through the breakup or the divorce is hard. But I like to look at it as staying is hard. So you have one hard path or another hard path. But one hard path might just lead to more happiness, more brighter days, more of a lighter you. And the other hard path might keep you as that fragment of the person you used to be. And I don't want that for you. Follow the path that makes you lighter and happier so that you show up to the world, and for the person who wrote this email, you show up for your kids as the best person you can be. That's what I want for you. I appreciate you. Share this with others that might benefit. Love and Abuse is the official podcast of the Mean Workbook, an assessment and healing guide for difficult relationships containing a 200-point checklist to help you not only pinpoint the exact behaviors causing difficulties in your relationship, but also clearly revealing to you why you leave so many interactions feeling bad. The workbook will help you make the next best relationship decisions for both of you. Use it to understand your own behaviors and how they affect those you love, or use it together to reveal issues that you both need to work on. Visit loveandabuse.com for more information. This show exists to remind you that you are not alone and you're not going crazy. You deserve to be treated with respect and kindness. You deserve honesty and sincerity. You deserve to be treated as worthy and significant because you are. Thank you for joining me today. We'll talk again soon.